As the dust settles on DeepSeek, we've had the chance to see who walked away from the impact it had on the stock market unscathed. Apple and Meta did not undergo the same rapid stock shocks as Nvidia, Microsoft, and others in the immediate aftermath of the DeepSeek R1 launch. The latter has actually seen a healthy surge in the past few weeks. Why is this, and who actually wins thanks to DeepSeek? You're listening to the ITPro podcast. Hi, I'm Rory Bathgate. My co-host Jane is unfortunately not able to be here this week, but I am joined by ITPro's news and analysis editor, Ross Kelly, to unpack the situation in more detail. Ross, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be back in a last-minute substitution.
Well, it's very kind of on theme, I feel like, on brand for DeepSeek to be quite reactive in our scheduling as well as in our coverage for DeepSeek. So we mentioned in the introduction there that Apple and Meta really haven't experienced the same stock market shocks as everyone else. You can visibly see when DeepSeek R1 really spooked the markets. If you look at any graph of Nvidia, if you look at Microsoft, there's a sharp line that goes down on the 27th of January. We really haven't seen that for Meta, have we? It's been a kind of steady increase.
Yeah, the situation with Meta is an interesting one because when you look at, a lot of the big tech providers in the US, the Silicon Valley providers, Meta is outside of the proprietary club, I suppose you could say. They have really put their eggs in the open source basket, and in fairness, Mark Zuckerberg's been very, very vocal about that over the last 2 years, and it seems to have paid dividends so far. They've had a lot of success with their Llama models, and when DeepSeek came along, obviously the fact that it was open source as well was obviously going to raise a lot of questions around cost and around, the cost to build not only, but also around, the enterprise cost to run and to be lapping up subscription models. With Meta, I think, they've been proven right, so to speak, in this regard.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen some commentary on X that had kind of pinpointed Meta's whole AI advantage as delivery, right? Their USP for AI is the platforms that they can deliver it through. So on a consumer level, you're looking at Instagram, you're looking at Facebook, and also some of their wearables. We might get onto that in a bit with the Ray-Ban tie-in they've got going on right now. But in short, Meta isn't so hung up on the model, are they? It's more about what they're doing with it, and like you mentioned, that cost of actually running the model and the inferencing, rather than making money off somehow leasing out a proprietary LLM in the same way that that Google does or that Microsoft does via OpenAI's models.
Yeah, I mean, it's the ecosystem that surrounds it that benefits Meta here. Like you said, around the social media platforms, which have been the company's bread and butter for well over a decade at this point. It is the same on the proprietary side of things, that ecosystem aspect. Obviously, Microsoft wants to drive customers, deeper into their suite of tools and solutions and software. Likewise with Google and other industry competitors. But with Meta, yeah, they're outside of that pack, and I think that gives them a greater degree of flexibility. It allows them to swivel on a sixpence, so to speak, and go with the flow. Go with the flow of the industry. Far easier compared to Microsoft at this point. They're so deeply woven with OpenAI that it's at this stage it'd be like turning a cruise liner compared to Meta. That's not to say it wouldn't be difficult for Meta if there was another major bombshell in the industry, but there is that just little extra flexibility there that really aids them.
Absolutely. It's also worth noting here, as we did last week when we talked about DeepSeek, that the model was actually in part derived from Llama, that Llama was used as a kind of distilling model for DeepSeek v3, along with Alibaba's Qwen. But therefore, when you deploy DeepSeek, you kind of have to make a decision whether you want the one that's been derived from Qwen or the one that's been derived from Llama. But that's just another feather in Meta's cap here, isn't it? It proves the viability of Llama as a model, as a platform model for producing even more advanced open source AI models.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you're looking at it perhaps from like a US enterprise perspective, you're probably going to go potentially with Llama there. There's a degree of knowing what you're getting with that particular model, knowing what you're getting with the company, compared to Alibaba. That's not to say there won't be Western companies that'll choose that option. It'll be a different strokes for different folks type situation. But yeah, it is definitely a feather in the cap. I agree with you there. And I think again, it just to go back to what we said initially, it is a real seal of approval for Meta.
I think something that's worth noting here is when we use the term open source, that's a bit of a contested term for Llama, isn't it? Whereas DeepSeek it's on
Yeah.
GitHub. You can download it. As I said last week, you can run it given the right hardware completely on device. Llama is free of charge for most people and for most companies even, but it does come with a caveat, doesn't it? That if you are above a certain size, you still need to seek permission from Meta directly, which essentially is only to put it out of the reach of direct competitors with Meta, such as, say, Google. But that at the time kind of got alarm bells ringing, didn't it, for some open source advocates?
Yeah, I mean the open weights argument has been sort of grumbling away in the background for quite a while now, and it seems to come up every time there's an update to Llama. You will get your purists who are saying this isn't completely open source. There are caveats here, but I mean compared to other industry models, it is far more flexible and open, I guess you could say, for
Mm.
a lot of organizations. Yeah, once you do get to a certain point in terms of usage, then there are going to be certain stipulations there. But that's a far different consideration compared to going all in with Microsoft and OpenAI or Google and their own proprietary LLMs and models. So yeah, I think a lot of it is messaging, and it comes back to that. I think Mark Zuckerberg has been very clever in how they've positioned Meta. I think it is the best stance for them. Initially, it was a way for them to differentiate themselves from competition in the space. They're going to stick to that at this point.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, another company that has shirked this big stock market effect is Apple. Now, while Apple was very slow to adopt generative AI, and for a long time, as we wrote about on the site, seemed to be sitting back, watching, doing some internal development, but keeping quite quiet on generative AI. It has, in the last 6 months or so, begun to roll out AI features, particularly on its consumer-facing products. Why is it that Apple might not have been as affected by this? And is there an argument that maybe Apple could seek to really gain from something like DeepSeek?
I think saying they were slow to jump into the AI race is a bit unfair. I think it was,
Mm,
quintessential Apple style. They're not going to make rash decisions. Tim Cook has famously spoken about this over the last 2 years. The fact that they weren't going to dive headfirst into what was essentially at that point an industry that was in flux. There was a lot of hype, a lot of hyperbole, and they've went about their business very intelligently. And when they released Apple Intelligence last year, there was this sense of wow, they've really entered the game here. This could really shake things up a little bit. But Apple has been insulated from a lot of the fluctuations in the market purely because of their focus primarily around on-device
yeah.
capabilities. Apple Intelligence, is spread across iOS, macOS, Vision OS. They put a huge emphasis on data security, data privacy. So running it on device, when you look at how people were speaking around DeepSeek R1 and its ability to be run locally, again, it's potentially a feather in the cap for Apple. Um, a lot of people were, questioning this at the time. I mean, locally run, smaller models. I mean, and the industry has just been pushing towards this. We covered this at the beginning of last year, I believe, around the rise of small language models,
Yeah.
particularly around the hardware aspect of it and how beneficial that will be. And here we are. You fast forward just over a year, and Apple's had, the last laugh again.
It does seem that way. Apple really spent the last decade building up its own internal approach to, well, everything that they need in their supply chain. there was some skepticism, certainly, around Apple building its own silicon, and Apple's M series chips have time and time again proved critics wrong. Most people now would say, yeah, it makes complete sense that Apple creates every aspect of its own hardware as much as possible. And if you extend this to AI, they've built the perfect hardware platform for running small language models on device. I completely agree with you. I think while it may not be DeepSeek specifically that Apple runs on device, we'll come on to the security maybe and privacy concerns around DeepSeek in a second. Certainly the idea of all data that AI uses just staying on your device. It's good for privacy, it's good for security, and it's good for keeping things low latency as well. That is very in line with Apple's whole mantra of it just works and it's secure, keeping everything on device, and DeepSeek proving that that's not only possible but competitive with cloud models is it's a big upset.
Yeah, and I think again, it's a similar situation to Meta in that, you know, from a hardware perspective, rather than perhaps, you know, the social media aspect of it, they have been insulated. They have their own ecosystem that they have faith in, that they can draw upon, and that they can integrate AI features within that. Consumer focus, I suppose, for Apple again isn't quite tied to the profitability aspect of generative AI. So from their perspective, again, they've definitely had the last laugh. I know I said that twice now, but it is so typically Apple. They're quite calm and sort of conservative about how they approach things, but it is impactful every single time.
It is. And they definitely wouldn't want to compromise things from a safety perspective. Obviously, no company would. But when it comes to things like open source AI, obviously the open source community is all for it. And there's no reason that anything that's open source would be inherently insecure. But at the same time, you don't just randomly download something off GitHub and assume that it's going to be secure. And this is something that's started to bubble up in the last few days around DeepSeek, isn't it? That we've covered on the site, that there are these latent security concerns, vulnerabilities, really, rather than DeepSeek actively trying to do anything malicious, that have some security researchers concerned about using that model in particular.
Yeah, I think what you said there around, you know, that they're not actively, you know, embedding these vulnerabilities in it is very important to say. You know,
Yeah,
jailbreaking isn't anything new with AI models. We've covered this quite extensively. I believe Anthropic models, OpenAI models in particular, have, you know, were initially susceptible to this, particularly around using, you know, certain languages. For example, you know, Scots Gaelic. We covered a story around researchers jailbreaking models using Scots Gaelic, and
yeah,
yeah, these are always going to be issues that arise when, you know, you have a nascent technology. Things have definitely got better. You know, when you look at the first 6, 7, 8 months of the sort of AI boom from the launch of ChatGPT, we were talking a lot about hallucinations. And when you fast forward to today, hallucinations, they aren't quite in the news cycle so much because these models have become far more refined, and, you know, they've been finely tuned to an extent that, yes, they do still happen, but far less frequently than before. With the DeepSeek situation, again, I think the hype around this definitely prompted a lot of people in the industry, particularly security researchers. You know, they like to pick away at things.
yeah.
It's what they do best. Cisco researchers picked and prodded at the R1 model and found that, I mean, they described it as critical safety flaws, but I think it's worth mentioning that in that same bit of research, that same report, that there were other leading models. So 3.5 Sonnet by Anthropic, GPT-4, and Llama 3.1, they all displayed issues as well when placed under duress. So I think DeepSeek isn't, you know, out of the ordinary here. This is going to be something that is a continual learning process for the developers themselves, and it's going to be, I suppose, you know, that cat and mouse game that you get with security researchers looking to find some form of issue, and it's a critical part of the process of the evolution here as well. So, you know, it's great that they're doing that, and, you know, it makes for great headlines if you want to be incendiary, I guess, or if you want to really scare people. But the reality is that this is so common that when you're involved in the industry, you just know, oh well, we need to be wary of this, and it will be weeded out.
Another concern on this front is where a model such as DeepSeek will fit in with burgeoning regulation like the EU AI Act. We put a piece out this week on the potential compliance issues that DeepSeek might have, particularly its resilience to jailbreaking attacks, like we mentioned a few minutes ago, from hackers. The EU AI Act specifically says that models should be resilient to this. As you mentioned, Ross, DeepSeek does show some worrying signs, doesn't it?
Yeah, again, with European regulators, it's a very high bar that's been set. It's not to say that DeepSeek isn't up to scratch completely. There were concerns. We covered this, like you said earlier in the week, and all models go through this rigmarole of testing. All models, have to be placed under duress, and they are tested to make sure that they're compliant. And I think there is an element again of, in our last episode talking about DeepSeek, there is perhaps a geopolitical angle to some of the concerns. So in Australia, there's been a ban on DeepSeek on government devices over security risks. When you look at the hardware aspect of it, what we were talking about around the potential security and data privacy protection benefits from running on device, I think this is an area, again, where DeepSeek is going to have a lot of success. It's an area that Apple has already having a lot of success in, and we see the market moving towards that as well, with the proprietary models, with Microsoft and Copilot Plus and their device ranges. It does afford the user that little security boost, I suppose you could say. But in Europe particularly, you have to be very careful. When Apple Intelligence was announced, there were delays in Europe in the EU around that, purely around those sort of privacy concerns. So Apple wasn't immune to that. So DeepSeek definitely isn't going to be immune to that as well.
Yeah, these security flaws are definitely an ongoing concern. And particularly, as we've mentioned, if you're deploying directly on device, you want that to be the last word on security. You don't want lingering customer concerns coming in from other angles. On that point of on-device AI, as a kind of final note, Meta is sticking with the idea of augmented reality, virtual reality. It's had some false starts, shall we say, in the last few years with, the metaverse, after which the company changed its name, really failing to take off. But the new angle from Meta is that one use for these small language models will be as an onboard assistant in its tie-up glasses with Ray-Ban and also its Meta Quest VR headsets. Now, the Ray-Bans are maybe a little consumer, but Meta continues to talk about its Quest headsets in vaguely businessy terms, and there are still people who champion VR as a potential future for business tech. What do you make of all this, and whether AI and wearables kind of have any real future together?
Yeah, I think AI might have been one of the best things for wearables in the last
Yeah.
few years. They were kind of just ticking along, and it was, for me personally, if we're talking about the Ray-Bans, I cannot find a use for
Yeah.
having AI integrated within a pair of shades. I'm sure there are people out there. I mean, it's very much a consumer focused. I think it's a consumer fad, isn't it? You're not going to be wearing Ray-Bans in an office meeting,
No.
and I wouldn't be sitting wearing Ray-Bans on a Teams call with you and the rest of the team. With the Quest headset, I can see that there are applications there, but again, the popularity of sitting wearing VR headsets in a work context. When you look back to the launch of the metaverse and the entire rebrand as well, who really wanted that? Who wants to sit in a virtual reality world
Yeah.
in a meeting? Your weekly scrum in VR. I just can't see it taking off at all. Maybe I'm very pessimistic. Maybe I'm just not very fashionable. More of a jeans and
Well,
Converse and t-shirt type guy than several £100 on a pair of Ray-Bans that have AI features. Yeah, I'm pessimistic, deeply skeptical.
this is something that maybe AI can make the case for it in the coming years. For now, we are a little unconvinced that this is where edge AI is really headed. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But Ross, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
As always, you can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website at itpro.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, as well as subscribe to our daily newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast wherever you find podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating or a review. We'll be back next week with more from the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.